Claire Sutton held the photograph up to the projector light and said what everyone in the room already believed. "This piano is finished. Anyone who thinks otherwise is not looking at the same photograph I am." The image on the screen showed a Steinway Model D concert grand 1923 that had spent 11 days submerged under 4 feet of floodwater in the basement of the Meridian Arts Center in Cincinnati. The soundboard had buckled. The case veneer had lifted along every seam. The action mechanism, 88 keys, 12,000 individual parts, had seized into something that no longer resembled a working instrument. Every head around the conference table nodded. Every head except one. Near the side door, a man in paint-flecked work clothes who had been called in only to confirm a moisture reading on the subfloor raised his hand. "I can restore it," he said. A few people exchanged glances. Claire looked at his visitor badge. Nathan Pruitt, contracted woodworker. She looked at the photograph. She looked back at him. 60 days, she said, not as an offer, as a sentence. Nathan Pruitt was not a man who explained himself. That was the first thing people who worked near him noticed, and it was usually the last thing they understood about him. He did not explain why he had taken a contract woodworking job at a regional arts center at the age of 47 when he had spent the previous 22 years running one of the most respected instrument restoration workshops in the country. He did not explain why he had sold the workshop in Louisville 4 years ago and moved to Cincinnati into a rental house with a 2-car garage and his 9-year-old son Theo. He did not explain the space between those facts because the space was named Caroline, and he had learned through a long process of trial and grief that naming it out loud to people who had not earned the right to hear it did not help anything. He woke at 5:30. He made coffee while it was still dark. He packed Theo's lunch before Theo was awake because Theo had a habit, inherited directly from his mother, of packing his own lunch and including only things that could not be classified as food by any reasonable standard. Nathan would remove the lunch Theo had secretly packed the night before, substitute something with vegetables, and say nothing about it. Theo would eat the vegetables without complaint and then look at his father at dinner with an expression that contained both disappointment and respect. Theo was 9. He had his mother's wide-set eyes and a habit of asking one question, receiving an answer, and then sitting quietly with it for 2 or 3 days before asking the logical follow-up, as if the question needed to age before it was ready. He carried a small spiral notebook in his back pocket and wrote things in it that he did not share. Nathan had never asked what was in it. Some things a person needed to keep private. Nathan had worked at Meridian for 8 months. He had taken the contract because it kept him close to Theo's school, because the work was honest, and because the facilities director who hired him had asked only practical questions during the interview. Nathan had described himself simply, woodworker, 20 years experience with period instruments and historic interiors. He had not mentioned the workshop. He had not mentioned that he had trained under a Viennese piano technician who had worked for Bosendorfer, or that he had restored instruments that had subsequently performed at Carnegie Hall, or that 3 separate museums had standing agreements with Pruitt Restoration Works before he closed the doors. He had not mentioned any of it because it had not seemed relevant to the job, and because the workshop was behind him, and the thing behind you was not the thing that got your son to school on time. The woman who had called Nathan into the conference room that morning was Claire Sutton, executive director of Meridian Arts Center. She was 44 and had spent the previous 12 years building Meridian from a mid-tier regional venue into something that the Cincinnati Enquirer had called, perhaps too enthusiastically, the cultural anchor of the Ohio Valley. She had the kind of focus that looked like calm from across a room and like pressure up close. She had a degree from Oberlin and a second from Northwestern in arts administration, and she used both with the efficiency of someone who had learned very early that passion without structure was just noise. The Steinway had arrived at Meridian 3 years ago as a gift from the estate of a woman named Dorothy Halstead, who had purchased it in 1961 and played it every day until the year she died. The instrument had been assessed at $340,000. It was the centerpiece of the main hall, the instrument every visiting soloist requested by name when they confirmed their dates. When the drainage system on the lower level failed during the October storms and the basement flooded, the piano had been there for a routine regulation appointment that had run long. By the time anyone understood what was happening, the water was already past the casters. Claire had retained an outside assessment firm. 4 technicians, 8 days, a 31-page report. The conclusion was precise and clearly stated the cost of restoration would exceed the instrument's insurable value. Replacement was the practical path. Meridian's largest individual donor was a man named Frederick Wall, who was 71 years old and had given $2.2 million to the center over the previous decade. He had attended Dorothy Halstead's final recital on that piano in 2019. When Claire presented the assessment findings in the board meeting, Frederick had listened without moving. When she finished, he asked the room one question. "Is there anyone here who genuinely believes it can be saved?" The room had not answered. Frederick had folded his reading glasses and placed them in his breast pocket and said, carefully and without heat, "I'd like someone to try." That was why Nathan had been in the room. Claire had wanted someone from facilities to confirm a secondary finding in the assessment about moisture penetration in the subfloor beneath the performance space. Nathan had confirmed the reading, given the number, and remained standing near the door because no one had told him he could go. He had looked at the photograph on the screen while everyone discussed the logistics of insurance claims and replacement timelines, and he had looked at it the way he had looked at broken instruments his entire adult life, not at what had been lost, but at what remained. He raised his hand. What happened next was the kind of silence that has a texture to it, people calibrating whether to respond and deciding, for reasons they couldn't quite name, to wait. Frederick Wall, at the far end of the table, was watching Nathan with an expression no one else seemed to be reading accurately. He was not amused, he was paying very close attention. "Frederick," Claire said, in the tone she used when she needed the room to understand something had shifted. She did not finish the sentence. Frederick finished it for her. "Let him try." Claire looked at the photograph. She looked at Nathan. She placed the small countdown timer she kept on the podium for board presentations on the edge of the conference table. 60 days, she said again. This time it was a question dressed as a statement. "Starting tomorrow." Nathan looked at the timer. He picked up his work order clipboard. "I'll need full access to the basement restoration space and the loading dock." He did not request approval for this. He stated it the way you state a measurement. Claire nodded once. Nathan walked out through the side door. That evening Nathan picked Theo up from after-school care at 5. Theo came through the door at a measured walk because Theo did not run unless something was genuinely on fire and regarded his father's face with the careful attention he brought to most things. He tilted his head slightly to the left, which Nathan had learned meant he had noticed something and was deciding whether to mention it. "Did something happen at work?" he asked. Nathan opened the car door for him. "I took on a bigger job today," he said. Theo buckled himself in. "A hard one? The hardest one I've had in a while." Theo considered this while Nathan pulled out of the parking lot. "But you know how to do it?" "Yes." "Okay," Theo said and opened his notebook and began writing something that Nathan did not ask about. Nathan made chili for dinner. Theo ate it without the negotiations that most food required and then sat at the kitchen table drawing. What he announced was a picture of a piano which looked considerably more like a brown rectangle with dots, but which Nathan said was very accurate and which Theo agreed it was. After Theo was asleep, Nathan sat at the kitchen table with the assessment report that Claire's firm had provided and read all 31 pages. The technicians were experienced and their documentation was thorough. They were also wrong about the thing that mattered most. The soundboard had buckled, yes, but the buckling pattern, based on the photographs included in the report, was consistent with differential swelling across the grain rather than the structural fracture the report described. A fractured soundboard was a replacement. A buckled soundboard, addressed correctly while the wood retained moisture, could potentially be coaxed back toward its original geometry. The window for that intervention was narrow. It had been 11 days since the flood. If the soundboard had dried without guidance, the opportunity was already gone. If it had dried slowly in a sealed basement with residual humidity from the water-saturated concrete, there was still a chance. The action mechanism was a different problem. The 12,000 parts had swollen and seized. That was not a restoration job in the traditional sense. That was a disassembly, a cleaning, and a rebuilding from the components out, key by key, hammer by hammer, a process that had a known timeline and a known method and required nothing beyond time, precision, and the willingness to do it. Nathan had done it twice before, once on a Bechstein from 1908, once on a Mason and Hamlin that had been in a fire. He had the tools and he had the documentation. His father had kept original service manuals for every major American and European piano manufacturer from 1880 through 1960, and Nathan had inherited those binders along with everything else in the workshop, and they were in his garage in Cincinnati in a fireproof cabinet under a moving blanket where they had been since he closed the Louisville location. He arrived at the Meridian basement at 10:30 that night. The overnight facilities manager, a quiet older man named Carl, handed him a key card without comment. Nathan walked through the empty building to the storage space where the Steinway had been placed, and he stood in front of it under the fluorescent light and put his hand flat on the case above the soundboard, the way he had put his hand on every damaged instrument he had ever met for the first time. The case was cold. The humidity in the room was 68%, which was higher than ideal for storage and lower than it would have been immediately after the flood. The wood under his hand had the particular density of material that had absorbed significant moisture and had not yet decided what it intended to become. That was the thing most people missed about wood. It was never actually still. It was always in the process of becoming something, responding to temperature and humidity in increments too small to see, and if you understood that, you could sometimes influence what it was becoming before it made up its mind. He got out his notebook, the one his father had given him when he turned 16, half filled with his father's handwriting and half with Nathan's own. He opened it to a fresh page and began writing in 2 columns. Left column, condition as observed. Right column, condition as it actually was, interpreted through 22 years of working with instruments that other people had given up on. By 2 in the morning he had 8 pages of notes and a sequence of operations that he was certain, not with the certainty of optimism, but with the certainty of experience, was the right approach. He looked at Claire's timer, which someone had placed on the windowsill of the storage space, perhaps as a joke, perhaps as a reminder. He picked it up, looked at it, set it down. Then he drove home, slept for 4 hours, and was back before Theo's school bus came. The first 4 days Nathan worked alone. Nobody offered help and he did not ask for it. He began with the case exterior, documenting every seam separation and veneer lift in a numbered diagram he taped to the wall of the storage space, a hand-drawn map of every point where the instrument had moved away from what it had been. He removed the action mechanism in sections, placing each component in labeled trays in the sequence it had come out, so that reassembly would follow the disassembly in reverse and nothing would require guessing. A facilities worker named Dennis stopped by on the second morning, looked at the labeled trays covering 2 folding tables, and left without saying anything. He came back an hour later with a folding chair and sat near the door and watched Nathan work in silence. After 40 minutes he said, "You want me to get you lunch from the cafe?" Nathan said yes. Dennis brought 2 sandwiches back and left the second one near the door and did not stay. It became a daily arrangement without discussion. The outside assessment team's lead technician, a woman named Harriet Osee, arrived on the 5th day. She had heard through Claire's office that someone was attempting the restoration and had come clearly to form her own opinion about whether that was reasonable. She stood at the diagram on the wall and studied it for several minutes. "You're approaching the soundboard as a moisture correction issue rather than a structural one," she said. "Yes. Our assessment indicated fracture along the treble bridge." "I know. I think the photographs show differential swelling. The interpretation comes from the surface checking, which looks like fracture but isn't." She was quiet. "We discussed that in the preliminary review. It didn't make it into the final report." "No," Nathan said, "it didn't." She looked at the diagram again. Then she left. Nathan continued working. Frederick Wall came on the 12th day. He arrived at 6:30 in the evening with a coffee cup and the unhurried manner of a man who had made his decision about being there before he left the house and didn't need to justify it further. He stood at the entrance to the storage space and watched Nathan work without speaking. Nathan knew he was there. He didn't stop. Eventually Frederick said, "My mother played a Steinway. Not this one. A smaller one, in our living room in Columbus. She played it every Sunday morning until she couldn't anymore." He said it without looking for a response. Nathan set down the tool he was holding. "What model?" Frederick looked at him directly for the first time. "I don't know. It was dark brown. I remember the sound it made when she played Chopin. It was the only time the house was quiet." Nathan held that for a moment. He nodded once. They stood in the storage room for another few minutes without speaking, and it was not uncomfortable. On the 11th day, Nathan drove to a specialty supplier in Indianapolis for $2,800 worth of soundboard cleats, hide glue and the specific gram strength required for a 1923 Steinway, and replacement hammer felt in the original weight specifications. He paid for it himself. He mentioned it to Dennis the next morning. Dennis was quiet for a while. "You know they might not pay that back," he said. "I know they might not," Nathan said. Dennis thought about this. "My father used to say that some work you do for the money and some work you do for the thing itself." Nathan looked at him. "Your father sounds like he knew something. He fixed boats," Dennis said, "in Michigan. 30 years. He paused. "You're a lot like him." He left it there. Claire came to the storage space on the 18th day in the evening, without advance notice. Nathan was working on the soundboard, applying the first round of cleating along the treble side, careful work that required the kind of attention that made the rest of the world stop existing. He did not see her come in. She stood near the entrance with her arms folded and watched for 20 minutes before he looked up and found her there. He did not seem startled. "What do you need?" he said. She said, "I'm looking at the work." He set down the brush. "I need authorization for $4,200 for replacement hammer shanks." Original specification: I found a supplier in Vermont. She was quiet, sent the request through facilities and the Indianapolis run, the $2,800. She paused. Send that too. She turned to go. The soundboard, she said at the door without turning back. Tell me what you're seeing, he told her. She listened to every word. When he finished, she said the outside firm had access to the same photographs. They did, but they read it differently. Yes. A long pause. All right, she said and left. The approval came back 2 days later, both amounts, no questions, no requests for additional documentation. He forwarded the confirmation to Dennis. Dennis sent back a single question mark. Nathan did not explain it. He went back to work. Claire began taking a longer route to her car in the evenings, the route that went past the window that looked down into the lower-level storage space. She told herself it was efficient that it passed by the recycling station she needed to check. She mentioned once to Harriet Osei, with the deliberate lightness of someone raising a minor point, whether Harriet had any updated observations on the restoration's progress. Harriet was quiet for longer than the question seemed to require. The cleating pattern on the soundboard, she said finally. I've done 2 soundboard restorations in 25 years. What he's doing is not something you learn from a course. It's something you learn from someone who already knew it. Claire absorbed this as if it were routine information and changed the subject. She did not go back and ask more, but she stopped telling herself the route to her car was about the recycling station. She had grown up around this industry in the sideways manner of people whose parents loved something and therefore made their children adjacent to it. Her mother had played piano, not professionally, but seriously, in the way that means you build your schedule around it rather than fitting it in. Claire had not inherited the love. She had inherited the vocabulary of it, the ability to speak about tone and touch, and the particular emotional geography of a well-voiced piano without having the lived experience behind the words. There was something in the way Nathan Pruitt worked, not urgent, not interested in being seen, moving through each step as if the step were the whole world for as long as it required, that touched something in her she did not have a category for. On the 25th day, Theo came with Nathan because the school had a professional development day. Claire had been told about the arrangement, and she had said it was fine, which it was. When she walked through the main lobby on her way to a donor meeting, she saw a boy sitting in a straight-back chair near the window with his spiral notebook open in his lap, writing something with complete concentration. A stuffed something, a dog or a bear, it was hard to tell which, was propped on the chair beside him. Claire stopped. One of the front desk staff appeared beside her. He's the contractor's son, 9 years old. He's been sitting there since 8 this morning, didn't move, didn't ask for anything, just writes. Claire looked at the boy. Theo looked up at that moment, the steady look of a child who has been taught, by example, to meet attention directly. Hi, he said. Hello, Claire said. Theo returned to his notebook. Claire went to her meeting. That afternoon, when the lobby was empty, someone left a small paper bag on the seat beside where Theo had been sitting. Inside was a piece of banana bread from the cafe. There was no note. 4 days before the deadline, Claire came to the storage space and sat on a wooden stool near the workbench. Nathan was voicing the hammers, a process of adjusting the density of the felt to produce the tone quality the instrument was built to have, patient work with a small needle tool that looked like nothing but was everything. Claire sat and watched for a while, and then she said, "Why didn't you tell me what your background was when you were hired?" Nathan did not stop working. Because what matters is the work. The background is just the explanation for how I learned to do it. The outside firm had 4 technicians, she said, with combined experience and equipment and a full week. They had what they had, he said. I had what I had. She looked at the instrument. The case had been refinished, the veneer seams had been pressed and glued and sanded to invisibility. The chrome hardware caught the light across every surface. The keys were back in the instrument, 88 of them, regulated and level. I declared it a loss, she said, in front of the full board, in front of Frederick. You had a 31-page report and photographic evidence. I'd have done the same. She turned to look at him. That's generous. It's accurate. You didn't have the piece I had. What piece? He kept working. I've seen this kind of damage before, twice. And both times people with more credentials than me said the same thing the report said, and both times they were wrong in the same way because they were looking at the surface and I was listening to what was underneath it. She was quiet. The sound of the voicing needle filled the space between them, small, precise sounds. Finally, she said, I was wrong. She did not dress it up. Nathan nodded once. What happened to your workshop? She asked. He set the tool down. My wife died, he said, not heavily. The way you say a true thing that has its own weight. Claire did not say she was sorry. Nathan noticed this and appreciated it. She said, Theo, he was 5. A pause. The workshop couldn't hold it together and hold him together at the same time. I chose him. He picked the tool back up. Claire sat on the stool for another half-hour and asked nothing more, and the quiet between them was honest. On the 58th day at 9 in the evening, Nathan sat at the piano bench and pressed middle C. The note did not speak. He pressed it again. The hammer moved, struck the string, and produced a sound that was technically a note and actually nothing. A thin, uncertain vibration that had no body to it, no resonance, no sense of the instrument behind it. Nathan sat with his hands in his lap and looked at the keys and understood with complete clarity what had happened. The regulation on the let-off point of the action, the moment at which the hammer releases from the jack and the string is free to vibrate, was not correct. The rebuilding process had introduced a small error in the let-off distance that was consistent across the entire treble section. It was the kind of error that was invisible until the piano was played, and then it was everywhere. He knew how to fix it. The tool was a let-off regulating screw, turned in increments smaller than most people would consider meaningful, section by section through the treble. Comparing the release point of each hammer by ear against the standard his father had demonstrated on a Mason and Hamlin in the Louisville workshop when Nathan was 19 years old. A Saturday afternoon in November when the light through the workshop window was low and cold and his father's hands moved with the patience of someone who understood that some problems could not be hurried into resolution. He had 2 days. Dennis called at 11. "How is it?" Nathan told him. Dennis was quiet. "How long to adjust?" 6 hours if my ear is working. Longer if it isn't. Is your ear going to be working? Nathan didn't answer. He heard Dennis exhale. "I'll bring you coffee in the morning," Dennis said, and hung up. At 6:15 in the morning, Theo called from the neighbor's house where he had stayed the night. He had been told something important was happening and had apparently been awake for a while thinking about it, because he asked no preliminary questions. "Dad, did it work yet?" "Not yet. But you're still fixing it?" "Yes." Theo was quiet for a moment. "You always figure it out," he said, "even when it takes a long time." Nathan sat on the floor or space with the phone against his ear and did not speak for a moment. "Go eat breakfast," he said. "I'll come get you tonight." "Okay." A pause. "Tell the piano hi from me." Nathan looked at the instrument. "I'll tell it," he said. He worked through the morning and into the afternoon. He adjusted each let-off screw in sequence, played the note, listened, compared, adjusted again. It was the kind of work that looks passive from outside, a man making tiny turns with a small tool, and is in fact the most demanding kind of work there is, because it has no reference except the one inside you, built from every piano you have ever learned to hear, and that standard cannot be borrowed or downloaded or confirmed by any machine. You hear it or you don't, and the only way to know whether you're hearing it correctly is to be very quiet and very patient, and to trust that what you learned from the people who taught you has become genuinely yours. At 4:47 in the afternoon on the 59th day, Nathan sat at the Steinway bench and played a C major scale from the bottom of the keyboard to the top. Every note spoke. The sound that came out of that instrument was not the sound of a piano that had been repaired. It was the sound of a piano that had been returned to itself, the full, even, authoritative voice of a 1923 Steinway Model D that had been built to concert hall and had spent 100 years fulfilling that purpose, and now, after everything it had been through, intended to continue. Nathan sat with both hands resting on the keys for a long moment. The storage room was very quiet. The piano was running. He called Dennis first. Dennis said nothing for several seconds. Then he said, "I knew you'd do it," in the voice of someone who had not been certain until this moment and was relieved to be wrong about that. Then Nathan called Theo. The 60th day the performance space was set as if for a concert. The Steinway had been moved from the storage area and positioned on the stage under the hall's full lighting system. And Claire had arranged, without public announcement, for the board members and Frederick Wall and the lead members of Harriet Osie's assessment team to be present. There were perhaps 40 people in the hall when the morning began, and by 9 there were closer to 60, because word had moved through the building with the particular efficiency of news that people want to carry. Nathan arrived at 8:45. He was wearing the same work clothes he had worn to the board meeting 60 days earlier, and he had a small smear of hide glue on his left forearm that he had not had time to fully remove. He stood beside the piano and did not make any announcement. He simply looked at Frederick Wall, who was in the third row, and nodded once. Frederick came to the stage slowly. He stood at the side of the piano and placed his hand on the case above the keyboard, flat-palmed, the way you touch something you have been waiting to touch for a long time. He stood there with his eyes forward and his breathing very even. 10 seconds, 20. Then he sat on the bench. He played the opening bars of a Chopin nocturne. Not well, Frederick Wall was not a pianist and had not claimed to be, but slowly, with the concentration of someone finding their way through something familiar by feel rather than by skill. The first note that came from that instrument settled into the hall the way a note from a great piano settles, not as a sound so much as a presence, something that fills the room and doesn't leave. Frederick stopped after 8 bars. His hands rested on the keys. He did not turn around. No one in the hall made a sound. Harriet Osei came to the instrument. She played a chromatic run through the entire keyboard, listening to each note with the trained attention of someone who knew exactly what she was evaluating. She stood and faced Nathan. "The soundboard," she said. "Walk me through the cleating approach." He walked her through it. She listened to every word. When he finished, she said, "Our report called it structural fracture. I want you to know that I understand now why that was wrong and why your interpretation was correct." He held her eyes. "You were working from the same photographs with less time than I had. You reached the conclusion the evidence supported." She received this without deflecting it. "That's the second time you've credited someone else's wrong conclusion fairly," she said. "You have a habit of that," he said. "I've been wrong enough times to know it doesn't feel good to have it pointed out badly." Claire had not moved from her seat in the 4th row. She was watching Frederick at the piano, who had not yet stood up, whose hands were still resting on the keys in the way of someone who has been somewhere they needed to be and is not ready to leave. She was aware of something in her chest that she did not have a ready word for, something between recognition and loss and relief, and she was not trying to name it precisely. Nathan came off the stage. He stopped a few feet from where she was standing. They looked at each other across the space of a few feet and whatever the hall held in that moment. "You won," she said. "It wasn't a competition," he said. Frederick asked if someone believed it could be saved. "I believed it. I just showed him." She looked at the piano. She looked at Frederick, who was finally quietly standing. "I said it was a loss," she said. "And you had every reason to," he said. "You just couldn't hear what I was hearing." She waited. "What were you hearing?" He said, 100 years of music that wasn't finished. The sound of sneakers on hardwood arrived before the voice did. Theo came through the side entrance at a jog. Not quite running, because Theo did not run, but at the pace of someone who has been waiting outside and has been patient about it but is ready now. And he stopped at the edge of the stage and looked at the Steinway the way you look at something you have known about for a long time and are finally meeting in person. His notebook was in his back pocket. His mouth was open. "Dad," he said quietly. "Dad, it's really big." Nathan crossed the stage steps and put his arm around Theo's shoulders. Theo leaned in briefly, the way 9-year-olds do when they are moved by something and do not want to show it too plainly, and then straightened up and regarded the piano with serious attention. He reached out one hand and pressed a single key, the middle C, and held it down until the note finished speaking. He watched the sound leave the room. "Is that what it was supposed to sound like?" he asked. "Yes," Nathan said. "That's exactly what it was supposed to sound like." Theo nodded slowly. He took his notebook out of his back pocket and wrote something in it. Nathan did not ask what it was. The people gathered in that hall, board members, technicians, administrators, people who had come to witness something they were not sure they believed was possible, heard the sound of a 9-year-old pressing one key on a restored piano and holding it down, and they felt, without exception, that the note was meant for all of them. Frederick drove home that morning by a route that took him past the Columbus Street where he had grown up. He did not stop. He did not need to. He had heard what he came to hear. He sat in his car at a red light and listened to the silence the way you listen to silence after music, not as the absence of sound but as the room it leaves behind. 2 days later, Claire asked Nathan to come to her office. She had created a position the previous evening, working alone after the building was empty. Director of Instrument Conservation. Full technical authority. The salary was 3 times his contract rate. She slid the letter across the desk. Nathan read it. "I have final say on all technical assessments," he said. "Yes. If I say something can't be saved, that determination stands without second review." A pause. "Yes. All right," he said. "I'll take it." Frederick Wall sent a sealed envelope to the front desk addressed to Nathan. Nathan opened it, looked at what was inside, and went to Frederick's office. "I can't accept this," he said. Frederick regarded him. "Why not?" "Because I didn't do it for the money. I did it because the instrument deserved to be heard again." The old man leaned back in his chair and looked at Nathan for a long time. "Then let me reframe it," he said. "My mother played Chopin on a Sunday morning in Columbus. I heard something in this hall today that I have not heard in 50 years. You gave that back to me." He pushed the envelope back across the desk. "This is for Theo's education, not from the donor, from the man who sat in the 3rd row this morning." Nathan looked at the envelope. He looked at Frederick. He picked it up. Harriet Osei found Nathan in his new workspace on the ground level, a proper conservation lab now with climate control and a parts inventory he had spent 2 days cataloging. She stood at the entrance with her hands in her pockets. "The let-off regulation," she said. "The manual approach by ear." Nathan looked up from the workbench. "Yes, would you teach me?" Yes, but you have to put the spectrum analyzer away first. She considered this. How long without it? Until you trust what you're hearing more than what the screen is telling you. How long did that take you? My father started when I was 16. I heard it correctly for the first time at 19. Harriet was quiet, then she pulled up a stool. A week later, Nathan was working late in the conservation lab. 3 instruments were now logged in the intake system. The first real inventory of a department that had not existed 2 months ago. Claire stopped at the lab ends on her way out, not to check on anything, not for any purpose she could have defended if asked, just because she was walking past and then she wasn't. "How's Theo?" she asked. Nathan looked up. It was not the kind of question he had been expecting, and he registered its unexpectedness before he answered. "He read 4 words in a row last night," he said, "by himself, off a piece of mail." Claire tilted her head slightly. 4 whole words, he wrote them down in his notebook afterward, Nathan said. For the record, a quiet beat between them that held more than what was being said. "Do you want to get coffee?" she said. "There's a place 2 blocks over. Theo's with the neighbors, so you have time." Nathan set down the tool he was holding. He looked at her for a moment, not calculating or assessing, just looking. He reached for his jacket. That night, after Theo was asleep and the apartment was quiet, Nathan sat at the kitchen table with his father's notebook open in front of him. The 2-column page from 60 days ago was still there, condition observed and condition actual, the interpretation that had started all of it. He looked at it for a while. Then he turned to a fresh page. He wrote 3 project names across the top. He looked at the wall where Theo had taped his drawing of the piano, a large brown rectangle that Theo had labeled in careful letters. "The piano is better." He looked at that for a while. Then he picked up the pen and wrote a 4th name. 60 days ago, Claire Sutton had stood before a room full of people and declared an instrument finished, and she had been right in every way a person can be right when the evidence in front of them is complete, and the piece they cannot see belongs to someone else. The missing piece had been a man who had learned, in a workshop in Louisville on a Saturday afternoon in November, that the difference between an instrument that is gone and an instrument that is waiting is not a question of damage. It is a question of who is listening, and whether they are quiet enough and patient enough and willing enough to hear past what they can see to what the thing itself is still trying to say. Nathan Pruitt had been listening for 30 years, and on a Tuesday morning in Cincinnati, something that everyone had agreed was silent had filled a concert hall and proved them wrong.